Thank you. Thank you. We're just slightly aware that the normally seamless and smooth transition is taking slightly longer than usual, so we didn't want you to think that we weren't coming back out. So I'm essentially here as a dancing monkey for the next few, until Jordan.
Hi, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I want to ask about everything. I'm going to start with...
We have half an hour, that should be fine, right?
I'm going to start with kind of a warm and fuzzier one, and then we'll get to sadism later. Okay, so I thought we would start by talking about novellas as a form, because you recently published two, The Last Days of New Paris and The Census Taker. And we could actually talk about novellas alongside what I think, I could be wrong, might be a little bit of a psychoanalytic turn in your writing, by which I mean a concern with the relation between trauma and the unrepresentable, or the unrepresentable in prose forms.
Yeah.
So that and novellas, and we can talk about the novellas each in more detail, but I also wanted to ask you just a little bit about the novella as a form.
Yeah.
I can go on, but I'm going to let you go.
I mean, I think you're right about the. I think there's probably a relation between the increasing interest I have in the novella as a form, and it's not an interest that's just me. I mean, I think more. I've seen novellas sort of cropping up, so that Zadie Smith just did a novella, and various other people who are publishing things as standalone novellas, which traditionally has been a very difficult pitch for publishers. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a little bit of a turn, and I hadn't particularly thought of it in terms of that kind of relationship of sort of language that you're talking about. But I think you're right. I think I'm not suggesting for a minute that I'm not, still interested in longer, novels and so on. But I think there's something about basically the longer a book gets, the more room there is for it for things to be wrong in it, and that's fine. All books have things wrong in them, but there's something about the kind of perfection of a novella that really works, which I think the best novella is always better than the best novel. And I think probably a lot of people won't agree with that, but there is a power to an effective novella that I think is completely unique. And in terms of what you're saying about trauma and so on, I suspect that this is related to kind of different phases of writing, like when the three long books, my second, third, and fourth book, feel to me very much now a young writer's books, and there's quite a lot of writing about mature style and like Said's work on late style and so on. But I haven't seen an enormous amount of work on the middle period of a writer. And this is what I've been getting increasingly fascinated with at the moment, because I think partly from kind of selfish reasons, which is that I think, assuming I don't die very young, I am, well, I mean, that's a serious consideration. My mother did die very young, and so I have a very strong sense of mortality and so on. But I hope that I'm entering a middle period, and I think there's a specificity to middle periods. And I've been reading writers, like Ballard is the middle period writer I've got most interested in, because there can be a tendency with some writers to sort of settle into a kind of relatively comfortable and efficient groove of what they know how to do. And then you've got someone like Ballard who goes very much a different way and starts breaking a lot of what he had previously done. And I think I would like there to be more discussion about middle periods, because they seem to me to be a kind of intrinsically traumatic moment in some ways. Plus, one has all the kind of specific traumas and so on. And so this census taker in particular is very much, at least for me, very much about trauma and language and what language can't say.
Right.
And maybe that's another reason for being interested in novellas, is because there are fewer words. And I've got increasingly interested in, as I mentioned in the introductory thing, in apophasis, in the unrepresentable, the unsayable. And somehow I feel like novellas are particularly good at that.
Yeah, yes, I'm gonna not push back, but I'm just gonna continue though. I mean, one of the truisms about novellas, and I don't think it's necessarily a useful truism, is that the characters don't have to undergo any development in the same way that they're forced to do basically in the novel. Mm-hmm. You have to develop, the character has to change. Mm-hmm. In novella, you're supposed to be dealing with characters who are developed, but your novellas, so we think about The Census Taker, which begins with that incredible moment of traumatic decharacterization that is also the onset of the subject. Mm-hmm. This literalization of the Oedipal scenario that you start with, right? You know it is that, where the character believes that he sees his father killing his mother, and he can't even say it.
This isn't spoilers, by the way. It happens very early.
It's the first page. But he can't even say it in his language is disjointed. He says, my father, someone, my mother. It's terrifying. It's very good. But your novella seems to be ranged around this idea of the character, of a character who's on some level constitutively really of all subjects, incomplete to himself, absent to himself.
I think that, I mean, this Census Taker, although I'm aware that it's a book that has a lot of people who have liked a lot of my other things have really disliked. It's had a very mixed reaction among a lot of readers. And there's a problem, I think, when you write, when you particularly defend or like a work which is less popular, there can be an intimation that you're being kind of contrary or defensive or both. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure I am both contrary and defensive and both. But I also, from where I'm sitting, I think there's very little question in my mind that this Census Taker is the best thing I've done. Mm-hmm. I always think it's the mortality thing again. I think in terms of what 3 books would, if I could only have 3 books, for some reason it's 3, in my coffin, what would they be? And this Census Taker is definitely one of them. And I think it is very much, I think you're right, it's something to do with the relationship to character. I think there's a lot of ways people talk about character in fiction that makes little sense to me as a reader. I don't mean in a kind of professorial way, like I think they're wrong. I just don't experience reading that way. And the most obvious and overt is when people say, as they do all the time, you know, I hated this book because I really hated the main character. Mm-hmm. It's just such an extraordinary way of reading. I don't understand it at all. But then there's another one which I find, which is maybe not quite as bizarre to me, but is pretty close, which is I hated this because I didn't understand it. And it's often to do with the characters. I didn't understand the characterization, or I didn't, but sometimes it's just to do with the story as a whole. And all I can say in response to that, and again, I'm sorry, I genuinely am sorry if it sounds defensive, is most of the books that I love the most, I don't for one second think I understand. Not only that, it's the not understanding that makes me love them. I mean, the obvious example I use a lot is Kafka. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You sort of, you read Odradek or you read, Metamorphosis, and you say, well, I like that because I got it. It's just, it's precisely because I don't know what's going on that I keep going back to it. And I think the thing about stuff that is, that this is related to character, because you're saying it's to do with the opacity of the work as a whole, right. I hope, but also the characters within it. And a lot of these nostrums about character development, character arc, are predicated on a really unconvincing model of both fictional characters and indeed real people. And that notion of the opacity of people, both real and depicted, including to themselves, spills over also into the book. So I don't understand this Census Taker either, and that's why I like it so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's a trajectory, I think, from Embassy Town on where you overlay 2 traumas. There's just the constitutive trauma of subject formation of being a character opaque to yourself. And then there are always the historical traumas also unrepresentable or unrepresented. So in Baslag, it has been speculated, in the census taker it's been speculated that it's part of the Baslag world because it's referenced. You don't have to respond to that. It's a rumor, but it's referenced that there's a potentially failed revolution. Yeah. That's never shown. And then we have this, what I'm going to call literalization of the Oedipal trauma. But then Embassy Town as well, you have the kind of trauma of the colonization of the Arabic world. And then there's this traumatic incident that happens to the main character where she becomes a simile, where she functions as language, which I won't redact for the audience. And I think, but what I've been wondering now in relation to this is about the children's book that you wrote. Because, but if you permit me, that is also ranging around this question of memory. Because one of the characters in the children's book recalls this worst breakfast, that it's called the worst breakfast, that they had, and the other character doesn't. Yeah. And one needs to recount it to the other. Yeah. And I was wondering if there's a kind of reparative nature that you're only able to do in a children's book where a memory that's impossible is collectively restored. And if you think that there's something about the writing for children, if you could talk a little bit about that.
The context for this, for people who don't know, is that recently I published a picture book for 3-year-olds with the great artist Zach Smith, and it's called The Worst Breakfast, and it's about exactly this. It's a discussion of the worst breakfast that these two sisters ever had, and one of them can remember it and the other one can't. It's very moving. I'm thinking about this as you ask it, because what you're doing is you're putting things in ways that hadn't occurred to me, but that feel quite intuitively persuasive. Particularly, there is something, I think, specific about writing for young readers. I think that's true. I hadn't thought about it in terms of reparative fiction, but I really like that. And partly because I've been reading Eve Sedgwick, and this notion of paranoid and reparative readings. There is if the older I get, I didn't start with a sense of the world as, unwounded and essentially good. But the older I get, the more I feel that it's terrible, it's unsustainable, it's brutal, it's dreadful. I get more and more upset about it. But that doesn't lead to a kind of quietism. It doesn't lead to quite the opposite. I feel more motivated at the moment, more politically motivated, more artistically motivated. Those things rise, as does my sense of the scale of how bad things are. And I think this is partly why I get very concerned. I mean, we've talked about this before. This is partly why I get quite concerned about the recourse to hope. People talk a lot about the necessity of hope. You think about Solnit's recent stuff on hope, and in the very simple sense of if you don't have a hope, if you don't believe at all that things could get better, there's no point doing anything. That's fine. But a lot of the talk about hope, political hope, and hope in fiction, is very unconvincing, and it feels to me, particularly among the left, and it feels to me more like a hope for hope. It's a kind of meta hope. It's terrified of its own fear. And I think that one of the things we have to start doing is mourning and grieving. There's a left slogan which is "Don't mourn, organize," and I hate that slogan because there's no contradiction between the two. And in fact, if you don't mourn, you're not going to be able to organize. So there is, I think, a kind of gentleness and a joy in writing for young children that allows you into this sense of not restoration, but reparation, reparativeness. And the nice thing about that heuristic is that it doesn't deny that things are bad, but it's sort of, it's a way of both reading and writing that you can kind of try and find ways of continuing anyway. So I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I do think that's true. A lot of the stuff I'm trying to do at the moment, and not just me, lots and lots and lots of people, is is keep going.
Well, you've led us to the question about sadism. And you've written very explicitly about what you call the return or rise of social sadism. And I'm going to quote you here. The sadism of capitalism is a deep grammar, and it is always functional, but it is never only functional. With the jouissance, or the enjoyment, comes the surplus, what Bataille might call its accursed share. In neoliberalism's decadence, social sadism is entering a febrile new stage. So you've been deeply engaged for a long time in a variety of ways with the idea of capitalism's very complex palette of cruelty. And there are two kind of directions that we can take a question about that. One is, if you wanted to say a little bit more about these thoughts on sadism as a political diagnosis for the present, the Brexit-Trump moment, these large-scale movements of overt sadism into the political center, with the caveat, of course, that these our imperial hegemons are constitutively sadistic at their root. But I think maybe you're wanting to think about a shift in the political landscape of late, where the mask of democracy has been completely disposed of. Or we can talk about it in relation to the role of sadism in your art. There are the primordially terrifying father in The Census Taker, the staging of battles between surrealism and fascism in New Paris, which I think are scenes that draw us back to a kind of more radical post-colonial roots of surrealism, what Suzanne Césaire and Tropique described as surrealism sustaining a massive army of negations. So not hope, but per se, but an army of negations. So we can talk about it, and we possibly can get to both, but I'm giving you the option. Do we want to talk about kind of political diagnosis in the present, or how it functions in your art, or both?
I think that one of the things that I have, in the nonfiction, have been trying to wrestle with is there's sort of, traditionally, I think there's two ways to think about when things are terrible in modern society, assuming that you're not happy with the way things are, assuming that you're not basically thinking, well, this is all hunky-dory, which some people do. But if you look at these kind of overt cruelties, one way is to essentially pathologize them and to say, what is this? What are these crazy, these crazy people who have nothing? Like, if only we get rid of them, then the system could return to balance. And then the other, which is common on some of the left, I think, is to want to never be caught out with shock. And so to kind of never be surprised at any surplus, and to always be able to explain everything. It's this kind of functionalism. So it's like, well, of course they did the Holocaust because this. That's the way the system works. And I think what I've been trying to do is sort of mediate, is to kind of get beyond those two. And that's why that formulation used about and/or, this idea that cruelty, I think, is absolutely integral to our system. Right. But that doesn't mean that there isn't sometimes a surplus, which, if you like, is beyond the baseline cruelty that the system would need, a kind of rationally cruel system. There is also an invested surplus, which the system can then fold into itself, absolutely. But one of the important things I think about recognizing that is that it allows you to talk about a structural shift. And you can, changes. Like, I think that we are, and I think Trump, to this extent, is a symptom, not a cause. I think we are tipping into a new epoch, a different way of doing capitalism. I don't think this is like, well, we just got to get through these 4 years and then we can get back. I think things are shifting massively. Essentially, that we've been in, a phase for roughly 3.5 decades, and it's shifting. And one of the axes on which that's shifting is this relationship to this kind of surplus cruelty. And you can track this. You can track it just very simply in sort of, for example, popular American attitudes. I'm not singling out Americans, by the way, around the world, but take this example of popular attitudes in the States to the death penalty and to particular kinds of extreme incarceration. It's absolutely, there's no question that they've grown coarser, crueler, harder, and more kind of invested in a sort of, on a mass level. I'm not, obviously there's plenty of counterexamples and heroic fights back against this, but over 20 years, you can, practices which would have been unthinkable have become norms. And then there's a baying for more. And I think that, in a way that the system's ability to kind of metabolize what was in one instant a surplus cruelty and make it functional is the most terrifying thing. And in terms of and that doesn't mean that those cruelties weren't like there in germ seed form and indeed, continuing, as you say with the César reference, like particularly internationally for centuries. And I think that's what gets to the second question, which is the art, fiction, music, anything can't help but reflect and sort of refract its context. And I think that I was born basically at the moment that time went out of joint and the kind of end of the long 50s. I was born in 72. I was born like when things started to abruptly pitch, the dollar shock and so on. And I'm now entering my middle period, I hope, at a point where we shift into whatever post-neoliberalism is. And I think post-neoliberalism is, carceral sadomonetarism. And it would be very surprising if that stuff isn't right there in the books, as it is in lots of books, including the books by people that don't care about this and aren't thinking about it. But if you're someone who does think about it, then obviously it becomes a little more overt. And New Paris is interesting because in some ways it's quite a counterexample to a lot of the other stuff. It's a much more light book, and it's a much more playful book, and it's a book that's sort of invented around the idea of it's essentially a novelization of an idea I had for a video game, but I don't have the power to get a video game made, so I wrote the novelization instead, or the novellaization. And to that extent, although it is for adult readers, it has more of that kind of playful nature that you might associate with the books for younger readers, which I think is partly why there is a lot more, it's a bit less, it's about trauma, but it doesn't feel quite as traumatized to me. And yeah, it's also just an opportunity to kind of honor not just the surrealism, which has been so important to me, but particular traditions of surrealism, the sort of the more marginalized traditions of surrealism, which I think have been really constitutive, both to the politics and to the art.
I'm thinking about something that you said during the reading in the short story. I think I'm quoting you correctly. The commons of damnation are privatized. Did you say this?
Yeah. Okay.
I really liked that. I think this relates to this idea I'm harping on about your grasp of an anti-fascist hell, or that neither realm can be abandoned by the forces of resistance. I mean, I think as for the political moment that we're in, I mean, without making it, there's a really horrible compression of both just a total carnival of domination without consent in the West, which is a different time for hegemony in the West. And it may have something to do with, I don't know, with privatizing. Once you privatize so many of the functions of the state, in other words, in forms of so-called care, the state is free to just be an overt monster. It doesn't even have to have the fiction of being for the people anymore. I don't even know if that's right. But that married with, we had Nikhil Singh write for The Last Salvage, in which he made the argument that dispensing the mask of democracy in this moment takes specifically the character of an inversion of victimhood, where the state. Yeah. So it's sadism, but it's an even more repulsive version of sadism, where the state as oppressor is adopting this kind of caricatured persona of woundedness that is borrowing from the language of identity politics to express like a ressentiment that is married with total power. Yeah,
well, you see that in a very banal way, in a very kind of silly way, when the most obvious, it's really cheap to quote Trump because like if, you know, obviously if he was scripted, it would be sent back like, you know, too broad rewrite, you know. But his thing when Pence got like spoken to incredibly politely, far too politely by the Hamilton cast, and Trump was essentially calling for a safe space, you know, using the language of like student activism and so on. And you see, so there's a kind of really kind of parodic level of that. And I think that there is, I mean, for me, there's a complicated negotiation because the recognition of the realities of trauma and what trauma creates has been, you know, a very, very important political movement and moment. But I also think that the sort of the kind of recourse to not recourse, that I want to retract that word, but the sort of a certain kind of sacralized victimhood it's not just the right that can do this, and that can create a very problematic politics, I think. So the way of kind of negotiating the acknowledgement of quite how bad things are and quite how real trauma is, and then acknowledging that that doesn't mean that one is ruined by it. That doesn't mean that one is irreparably harmed by it. That doesn't mean that one cannot salvage oneself and salvage oneself in the comradeship of others, is a very complicated negotiation, but I think it's a crucial one. And not to be too glib, and I would want to say this with with a lot of care, I think one of the things that art and fiction can do is be a component of that salvaging process. The reason I'm the reason I'm harping on the reason why that's important to me is I think for a long time I had a kind of a sort of guilt complex about. I had a lot of guilt about being essentially a fiction writer, that I felt that it was. I think some part of me felt, because I wouldn't have defended this intellectually, but I think some part of me felt that it was an indulgence, and that really what one should be doing is writing like important, actual things that matter, non-fiction. And of course, lots of my friends and people who are just as political as me were saying, no, this is ridiculous, don't be silly. And I think one of the things that started to happen, but the reason that I was thinking that is because I also think that a lot of claims that are made for writing and for art are ridiculously overblown. So the idea that we turn to literature to kind of foster our empathy, to heal us, to kind of heal society. Plenty of dictators have wonderful taste in books. Plenty of awful fascists write beautiful things, like genuinely great books written by sadistic people. And essentially, I think this is a kind of it's a kind of comforting fiction that a particular kind of liberal literature tells about itself. And I didn't want to fall into that. But I'm tentatively feeling now a little bit more at peace with, like kind of constitutively at peace, rather than just intellectually knowing it's true, with the idea that fiction and indeed, art and music and so on, are, genuinely are not just fripperies, and that they're certainly not everything, but they are a component of something, and what that something may be is a process of salvage.
Well, the salvage, I mean, that really gets to this, the kind of really consistent presence in your work of the dissolution of the fiction of bodily integrity, and your literary practice as perhaps a kind of structural resistance to the sadism that we're describing, although I think the jury is still out on whether sadism is best represented as excess or discipline, but perhaps it's both.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Because I think that's really important. I think that's really important, which is that for a long time, I think that there was this notion that, essentially sadism is buttoned up.
Right.
And, the classic figure of the political sadist is, in culture, is the Nazi in his black leather, standing ramrod straight. And it's this notion of repression that bursts out into sadism. So that essentially sadism is a kind of excrescence of repression. And what that neglects is the very strong, it's not as powerful a cultural tradition, but that very strong cultural tradition of the fascist Baroque, the fascist Rococo, the kind of, the dandy, the sadistic dandy. And I think that's quite important because it's important politically because it allows us to understand that, the figure that may come, the rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem may not be in the shape that we thought it would be. Mm-hmm. And I think it's artistically important because it punctures a certain kind of self-conceit, which is that because we are flamboyant and playful, we are essentially the forces of life and joy and, bullshit. There were, there were clowns doing the murdering in a lot of camps, and I don't just mean camps in Germany,
Yes, yes, I know. This, unfortunately, I'm trying to segue to something that's easier to end on than clowns murdering murderous clowns. But I think, I mean,
it's not unfitting.
It's not unfitting. I think it's very fitting. All right. Thank you. I mean, I suppose we are out of time. I guess I'll just say I do think that your work inserts a very important wedge of body horror between the murderous clowns and us.
Just because the grotesque can be about sadism doesn't mean it can't also be anti-sadistic. Right. And if I can hope for anything, it would be that the grotesque, which I love, is an anti-sadistic grotesque.
That is my hope as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jiran.